In countries like Australia, cigarette prices have risen massively due to higher taxes. A pack of cigarette can even cost more than $40 in Australia now. But despite such huge price rises, people still continue to buy cigarettes. Why? This behavior is explained in economics through the concept of elasticity. Hi friends, welcome to Econverse. I'm Abrar and I am a fellow student who topped in GCSE Economics last year in Oman. On this channel, we make learning economics simpler, clearer, and hopefully a lot more fun. In this video, we're going to be looking at the concept of price elasticity of demand. Let's get started.
Alright guys, when we look at the price elasticity of demand, let's start off with the definition. What does the price elasticity of demand mean? So the price elasticity of demand refers to a measure of the responsiveness. You have to remember the word responsiveness. So it measures the responsiveness of quantity demanded to a change in price. So a measure of the responsiveness of quantity demanded to a change in price. So there's a formula for this. So essentially the formula goes like this: percentage change in quantity demanded over percentage change in prices. So I have an analogy that you can use to remember this particular formula. So you have to think of it like you queue before you pee. You know what you mean? Like, you know what I mean? Like, you queue before you pee. Okay, my bad. Let's move on. So what does this formula indicate? So it basically shows that when there is a change in price, the PED shows the extent by which demand extends or contracts. So there are two ways of interpreting this particular formula. So there's firstly the sign of this answer. So the sign of the answer is always, or in most cases, going to be negative. This shows the inverse relation. If you remember, demand and prices are inversely related. When price increases, demand decreases, and vice versa. And the other interpretation is the size of this. So higher the size, so it basically depicts the extent. So higher the extent by which it extends or contracts. Extend is when demand increases, contract is when demand decreases. So, and lower would be lower the extent by which it extends or contracts. I hope that makes sense. So we've looked at the formula, we've looked at the ways to interpret the formula. Moving on, let's look at the 5 important degrees of elasticity. So when you look at the 5 degrees of elasticity, there's essentially 5 main numericals that you need to remember. PED equals infinite. Now this means when there is a complete change in quantity demanded in comparison to the change in price. Now this is depicted on a diagram like this, on a demand and supply diagram like this. So when you have your demand and supply, when you have quantity, and when you have price, a perfectly elastic good, or one with PED of infinite, would be a demand curve like this. It would be horizontal. This basically indicates that at the same price, the quantity can increase or decrease. You call this perfectly elastic. Moving on. So there's a high extent by which demand extends or contracts relative to the change in price. Moving on, we have PED equals 0. Now this means there's no change in quantity demanded compared to the change in price. Now this is depicted on a diagram like this. So essentially you have the demand curve somewhat like this. So as you can see, there can be multiple price levels, but the quantity is always the same. So the quantity doesn't change at all. And this is called perfectly, I want you to try and think, perfectly inelastic. You're right. Moving on, what if PED equals 0? Now this is slightly important. This basically shows that the change in quantity demanded equals the change in price. So essentially how this looks like on a diagram would be somewhat a 45-degree angle demand curve. Now this diagram that I've drawn may not be accurate because I'm not drawing it with a ruler, but essentially it's somewhat like a 45-degree diagram. And in this case, oh wait, I've made a mistake. In this case, PED is 1. So it's when the change in quantity demanded equals the changes in price. The fourth degree of elasticity is elastic demand. Now this is when this relatively more change in quantity demanded over the change in price. And in this case, PED is greater than 1. By the way, this one, when it's 1, is called unitary elastic. And the next one is called relatively elastic demand. Relatively. Okay, and this is when PED is greater than 1, which shows that there's relatively more change in quantity demanded. Now in this case, if you remember, when it's elastic, it's horizontal, which means when it's relatively elastic, it's still a demand curve that is quite much looking like a demand curve, but it has to be slightly more horizontal, somewhat like that. And the next one is when PED, the value of PED, is somewhat greater than 0 but lesser than 1. In this case, PED is relatively inelastic. Now if you remember, inelastic was somewhat vertical, so in this case demand is sloping towards becoming vertical, so it is relatively inelastic. So the change in quantity demanded is relatively lesser compared to the change in price. So we've looked at the 5 main scenarios or 5 main degrees of elasticity. Now let's think about this. What determines elasticity? Determinants of PED. What determines the measure of responsiveness of quantity demanded to a change in price? Now there are 5 main things that I would say. Firstly, there's brand loyalty. I want you to think about this. There's obviously certain brands that you'd always stick to. For me, it is the MacBook. It is the Apple brand that I would stick to whenever I want to go and buy a laptop. For me, I don't consider any other brand. I'm quite loyal to the brand, so that means that I am a consumer which has inelastic demand. So despite the changes in prices, my quantity demanded for Apple does not change because I'm loyal to the brand. The second one is something called taste and preferences. Now, essentially, when tastes and preferences change, there could be elastic demand. So, when the price of something increases, your tastes and preferences could move to the other. So on and so forth. It could also mean sometimes your tastes and preferences for something could be so strong that your demand for it is inelastic. Now, the price of related goods also affects the determinants of PED, is also one determinant of PED, because if other goods are cheaper, then chances are you have elastic demand for that particular good. Now, there is also a factor called seasonal demand, which is when, based on seasons, the demand for something could be elastic and could increase. And then lastly, there is one important one, and this is called proportion of income that is spent on the good. So there's three main proportions of income that I want you to look at. So essentially you have three main proportions. Firstly, you have a normal good, then you have a luxury good, and lastly you have the inferior good. Now, luxury goods could be, examples of them could be something like luxury watches or jewelry and so on and so forth. Inferior goods are goods like second-hand cars, and normal goods are just goods like food and clothing. So essentially, which one it falls into could determine the elasticity of demand. Now, I want you to try and find examples of elastic or inelastic goods and services and put them in the comments section.
If you think this video helps you understand the economics better, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to join the Econverse. In the next video, we'll be looking at, you guessed it right, we're looking at price elasticity of supply.